Hello and welcome to The Pledge. This week, we said goodbye to a British comedy legend. The irrepressible Ken Dodd passed away at the age of 90 after decades of making us laugh. The papers were full of his best one-liners, such as, "I haven't spoken to my mother-in-law for 18 months. I don't like to interrupt her." Now, who could that remind me of? Coming up,
Thank you.
Takes on the Telford abuse scandal. Afua wants more of our money for public services. Carol speaks plain English. And Majid says we need to look at why anti-Muslim letters are being sent to the public and to MPs. We are very definitely cursed with interesting times, and never more so than this week. A British citizen lies on death's door along with his daughter in Wiltshire, apparently the latest victims of a Russian state assassination attempt. An inquiry's been announced into 14 other deaths on UK soil which could be linked to Russia. The Prime Minister's deadline that the Kremlin explain what has happened whooshed by, and then the tit-for-tat started. Theresa May announced the expulsion of 23 Russian diplomats, cancelled high-level contacts between the two countries, and said top-level Brits would be a no-show at this summer's World Cup. The Russians called this an unprecedented provocation. It's hard to keep up, not to mention scary. We know the Russian president is unplayable. But is it already stalemate or checkmate to Vlad? It's very much game on. More than ever, we need to talk about Putin.
And, of course, as we now know, Russia has responded, as we knew they would, and some of our blokes and women seem to be coming home from Moscow.
But diplomats, not potential spies this time. Well, actual diplomats.
We would call them But anyway, OK, let's move to your central point. My only concern is this. When Mrs May and the British government decided on the action that they first did and gave Russia that ultimatum, did they honestly expect Russia to say,
"You're right.
Hands up, you've got us, you know, gee, we shouldn't have done it"? Yeah. So I thought that, now, having said that, I find the stance by actually a lot of callers to my show saying, why are we doing this, why are we doing... This is the sort of thing that goes on. I'm sorry, there's only one
why
thing
are we
more...
doing what?
Why are we being so confrontational to Russia? I'm sorry, quite right, thank you. Well, the way I see it, there's only one more hostile action than coming onto foreign soil and murdering, potentially murdering some of your citizens, and that's war. There's only one more step after that. So I think he is playable. My one concern is I would like to see better alliances built with people such as NATO. I welcome the support of the US. I welcome the support of Germany. France seems to say one thing one day, i.e. the French ambassador to the UN says total support to Britain. Then suddenly we see the sort of official spokesman for Macron saying, I think we need to wait. So we need to have plenty of alliances. We need to take him on, but the next step is key.
Afua, can I just ask you whether you feel that the French position is, which is almost like the Labour leader of the opposition's position, which we need to see absolute proof before we raise the stakes, is the right position to hold? Or what do you think?
I think the current situation is very confusing. I think for ordinary people, the idea that a foreign state could be going around poisoning people on the streets of town centres is absolutely terrifying. And, you know, the fact that 500 people in Salisbury were asked to go and take precautionary measures, I mean, that is something that strikes fear into so many people's hearts. But I think it is confusing. I think most of us don't know what we know about this nerve agent. We know that it's military grade. We know it's not something ordinary people can manufacture at home. You need basically state-sponsored or large-scale labs to do it. But we haven't seen anything that explains what the government knows. And when Jeremy Corbyn suggested we would like to see that, he was branded as a traitor, and Labour quickly retracted the position. But that's now, as you said, what Macron is saying. Now, I think that we can't afford to be divided over something like this. You know, as you said, this is a really serious retaliatory measure against Russia, and I would like to see some kind of consensus that it's the right thing to do. But I do feel that there are still more questions than there are answers, and I think that the idea that anyone who questions that is kind of shut down just makes me feel more uncomfortable.
You know, I mean, I kind of look at this and I think the timing of this is incredibly suspicious. You know, the Russian elections are on Sunday. Now that Moscow, I mean, I've just been looking at stuff coming out of Russia today, the people are saying, you know, we are the world's scapegoat. Why would we do this? This is exactly what Putin wanted. Otherwise, in the lead up to the election, he would have had to explain why the Russian economy has been in the toilet for the last 3 years. Now, they've been living under conditions there, the like of which America was suffering in 2008, 2009. And Putin has done what all Russian presidents have done since the October Revolution. He has created a common enemy, and that is us now. And it's also now the rest of the world. He says, I didn't do this. We say, yes, you did. The rest of the world is now joining in saying, yes, you did. So now he doesn't. He will go to the elections on Sunday, and he will win by a landslide, because the people look and say, Putin is protecting Mother Russia. We're being attacked by the rest of the world. And he's, you know, you say he's not playable. He's not playable, because even if we give him proof now that this is a nerve agent thing, he will still say, it's not me.
But
it's not me. This is what he does.
If this was Putin's electioneering, we all knew that he was guaranteed to win the election on Sunday anyway. He's just shoring up his power base. What's going on?
Well, it's a warning shot, and that's why there are many ways to kill somebody, but to use this particular nerve agent that has a Russian signature on it is a warning shot to other Russian dissidents inside and outside of Russia, not to oppose Putin. And I think the other thing we've just got to keep in mind here is the real human cost to what's just happened. And I'll come back to why I think that's important. But let's just have a look at this human cost here.
What we're talking about, sanctions or reaction for what happened in Salisbury, need to be very serious. Even now, what was saying from Moscow, you need to react, and you need to understand, is there some kind of message?
That was, if you recall, Marina Litvinenko, the widow of Alexander Litvinenko, who was murdered by the Russians in 2006. Two Russian operatives were charged by our government for that murder, and nothing else was done. The human cost, of course, is she lost a husband, her son lost a father. And why I refer to that is that Putin has done this before, and he's gotten away with it. And if there's one thing he respects, is strength. And one thing he exploits is weakness, because he's a thug, he's a gangster, he's a bully, and he notices weakness when he sees it.
Hold on.
Last thing I'll just very quickly say is that, therefore, we need to respond with strength, whatever that response may be, but also this is an opportunity for us to drag Trump away from Russia. So Trump has said he'll back Britain. It's an opportunity for us to pull Trump away from that unhealthy relationship that he flirted with during his election campaign, and saying that he admired Putin for some reason.
I just want to, let's hear what Theresa May said, because there were accusations over the weekend that she had been very limp, not just about this alleged assassination attempt, but also about previous ones. And so this is what she said in the Commons.
They have treated the use of a military-grade nerve agent in Europe with sarcasm, contempt and defiance. So, Mr. Speaker, there is no alternative conclusion other than that the Russian state was culpable for the attempted murder of Mr. Skripal and his daughter, and for threatening the lives of other British citizens in Salisbury, including Detective Sergeant Nick Bailey. This represents an unlawful use of force by the Russian state against the United Kingdom.
But this is quite interesting, Afra, because this could flush out Trump from, as Madge was saying, from his relationship with Russia.
You know, listening to that statement from Theresa May, I partly agree with it. I mean, the response from Russia has been remarkable. The contempt, the sarcasm, the threatening nature, starting to refer to their nuclear arsenal. I mean, it's terrifying.
Did you see the stuff on Twitter the other day where they put files
of
what was supposed to be
and actually,
from the Russian
in a way, I'm far more disturbed even than the initial attack by the Russian response. But what she said is also a non sequitur. She said Russia has responded in this way, which is true, therefore it was the Russian state. Now, those two things don't necessarily follow.
But it's only made in Russia, this stuff. It's only made in Russia.
I know that, Carol, but you know, you said that the rest of the world is coming round to our view. It's true and it's not true. I mean, as we said, Macron has said he wants more evidence.
The UN has backed us, absolutely.
Trump's silence was notable for the immediate days after. And now Rex Tillerson, who's now been fired, is the one who's come out.
What he said is, as soon as he had confirmation that it was from Russia,
they haven't got confirmation
he would back us, and that he's done absolutely that. The UN has backed us unconditionally.
He's also said, I'm standing with the Brits on this one. There are only four nations in the world that are purportedly able to develop this kind of nerve agent. That was before we identified it was a very Russian-specific one. So generally, it's the French, the British, the Americans and the Russians. And, of course, we didn't attack ourselves, and I don't think Macron attacked us.
I'm not questioning whether the nerve agent came from Russia. And as you said, they leave a footprint which can be traced to a particular...
So what is it you're saying you're lacking in answers for?
I mean, it would be great if we could see that evidence and know about it, because we haven't been told. And maybe there's a reason why, and then it would be good to know the reason.
What do you think we lie about?
It's important to say that...
Carol, I'm not accusing anyone of lying. I'm just saying that we have had a series of circumstantial facts put to us, and this is a big deal. This is
Athol, you must be aware the Foreign Secretary has said it is now being sent to the Office for Elimination of
They haven't had the
warfare.
results yet.
No, but I mean, that is an independent, unimpeachable body. But one thing I want to pick up, which I thought is something we haven't really touched on, which I found truly extraordinary, there was great work done by the Times this week on that, is the 14 other cases that are being reviewed, where people where, and I bear in mind, we must be very careful because there will be relatives, but someone supposedly died by jumping from the roof of a multi-storey
complex. That was actually
a
BuzzFeed.
That was BuzzFeed.
Someone jumped in front of
the British spy that was found
zipped in the bag, and again, families might be watching, and someone who stabbed himself to death repeatedly. Now, I don't even want to think about the poor family, but that is a very strange way to take your life, to repeatedly stab yourself.
Nick.
Doesn't it show the arrogance of Putin that he can come into this country, he doesn't care what happens, he's unimpeded by any kind of punishment we can throw at him. He doesn't care that we're going to impose sanctions. He just does it to make a point.
Nick, I'd like to hear... I mean on the face of it, nobody had heard of this spy before his attempted murder. What was the geopolitical purpose of, if it was the Russians, which we assume it was, of them getting rid of somebody so apparently insignificant and then creating such a massive, massive firestorm?
Just want to say that there is a change in the French position, by the way. We're now hearing from the Élysée Palace that they have come to the conclusion it could be, quotes, nobody else than Russia. So that's the official... Majid touched on it, and he's absolutely right. The British way of life is a threat to Putin. It's what Russians will aspire to. They want to come and live in a country such as this. So what Putin has to do is make you realise, as Majid said, you want to go and live there, you think that's great, you have the freedoms of the West, Mother Russia can always come and find you. That's the message.
He also said he would get revenge on the enemies of the state, and that's exactly
like the Godfather in the Mafia, right? They never let one loose string unattached go, right? If anyone has been defecting, if anyone's a traitor, if anyone said anything bad, the only way you can operate, if you're a thug like he is to make sure that nobody gets away with it. The minute one person gets away with it, it's a crack in the armour that is exploited by your enemies.
You can run, but you can't hide from Putin.
We have to run from your debate, but I'm sure all of us can agree that we wish the best to those two people in Salisbury and the police officer as well. Now, another town this week joined the list of shame, where sex gangs have roamed seemingly unchecked to prey on girls as young as 11, raping, drugging, beating, trafficking, and potentially even murdering them in the process. What's happened in Telford could be the worst case of a paedophile gang involved in widespread child abuse the country has ever seen. But as I read the names of those convicted, something struck me. In Telford, they included Azir Ali Mahmoud, Mubarak Ali and Adel Ali. In a similar case in Rotherham, Razwan Razag, Adil Hussein and Zafran Ramzan were among the guilty. To Rochdale now, Mohammed Amin, Abdul Aziz and Mohammed Sajid, among others, were convicted. And now to Oxford, where it was Anjam Dogar, Kamir Jamil and Zishan Ahmed ending up behind bars. Now, a very broad reckoning of the guilty shows around 80% are men of Pakistani and Bangladeshi origin. Well, a couple of observations then. Why do they appear to view white girls as objects to be traded and even disposed of? And what is their community doing about it?
Nick, this is a tragedy that's been going on up and down the country, and unfortunately, the police and local councils have been complicit in covering up this scandal.
Well said.
Time and time again, they have found that British, Pakistani and Bangladeshi South Asian Muslim men like me have been involved in grooming underage white girls and targeting them in what I would describe as racially motivated sexual assault. And for fear of racism, the local politicians for fear of losing votes, and the police for fear of being sacked by those local politicians, have been hiding this situation. And of course, then it led to a national inquiry. We know that because the conclusions of the national inquiry were the same. I'm going to read to you something, because Telford could well be worse than what happened in Rotherham and Rochdale. And yet still, despite that, we have the superintendent for Telford and Wrecking, Tom Harding, saying the following. He said that what I would say is sexual offending across Telford and Wrekin is virtually identically proportionate to the breakdown of society. So it's not one particular section over others. Forgive the language, the French, but this is total BS because he's confusing two types of sexual offences. We as Quilliam looked into this, and I'm going to come to the stats in a second.
I know you've done a lot of work, and you've done a lot of broadcasting. You're a real pillar in this area, I have to say. Salute what you've done.
Thank you. Type 1 is the grooming of underage white girls, or any girl generally is type 1 as a category, the grooming of underage girls by gangs of men. Now, in type 1, where the grooming gangs are involved, it was found in our research that we found, I'm going to put this up on the screen for you, that 84% of those involved in type 1, which is gang grooming of underage girls, were, what it says there, South Asian. To be specific, they were Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslims, right? Type 2, which is, I hate to use the phrase, ordinary paedophilia, what we normally understand by the word paedophilia, is representative of wider society. So one statistic found it was about 87% in type 2, which was paedophiles, 87% were white. Another found 100% were white. But of course, that's not surprising because the vast majority of the country is white. What's interesting is the disproportionate figure of 84% hailing from my background. Why that's interesting is because roughly only 2% of the country are Pakistani and Bangladeshi Muslim men who are responsible for 84% of collective grooming of underage white girls.
You'll respect that. I must get other people involved. A fantastic body of work. Carol, I saw you nodding as I was going through the list of names.
What particularly sickens me on this is that, in all of these places that you've mentioned, the police, the social workers, the care workers all knew what was going on. They couldn't pretend that they didn't. This has been going on since the 90s. And yet they chose, because of what you're talking about, Majid, because the biggest crime is to be accused of discrimination against ethnic minorities, they chose to throw these young girls to the wolves. And I want to show you, a bit of film here from the MP of Telford.
What has happened in the past is it's not been clear both to local authority or to the police that what is being reported is a crime. And I think procedures have improved, I think practices are now different, but there are still young people coming forward who feel that their voices are not being heard.
You see, that to me is absolute nonsense because these girls have gone and made their voices heard for decades and no one was listening. That is a really disingenuous comment because these girls had no way. It's not just a case of somebody grooming someone online. Some of these girls, as young as 11, were dragged into filthy, dirty houses and gang raped by men. They were perfectly aware that was a crime.
And compare and contrast with another Labour MP in Rochdale or Rotherham who made the point and was promptly sacked from the front bench for talking in the sort of terms that Majid has. We must get others involved.
But just let's say over Telford, 2 of the whistleblowers who tried to protect these girls were fired.
All right.
So Lucy Allen, the MP we just heard from, she has called for a public inquiry and it seems that there will now be one. And it's important to say she has been calling for an inquiry since 2016. So
there has been one.
Before we were all talking about this, she was talking about the true scale of the abuse in Telford.
But there's been
let's just hear from Afua. Yeah, on you go.
So I think anybody with any decency is absolutely appalled and horrified by these, and anybody who cares about children being safe has to speak out about this and say something is going wrong where we see these patterns replicated up and down the country. And I agree with everything that Majid has said. I think my concern in the way we talk about this, and I've done a lot of work on this as a reporter, as social affairs editor before, is that there are 2 narratives that are both equally dangerous, right? We hear that the reason that the police and councils failed these vulnerable girls is because they were afraid of being accused of racism. Whether that's true or not, that is no excuse. There is no excuse for public servants not doing their basic job of protecting vulnerable children. The other narrative I've now heard from people who work in child protection is that police and local authorities now have this idea in their head that people who abuse children are Asian men of Muslim backgrounds, and that is obscuring the reality of other children who are being abused. Now, that's equally dangerous because if you care about children being safe, you want all children to be safe. You don't want prejudice in local authority and police keep putting children at unnecessary risk. The thing I would say about Majid, your figures, which I remember at the time, and it was really important work. When we talk about this being an Asian problem, a Muslim problem. 100%, according to the NCA, of paedophiles, so not people who exploit vulnerability, but people who are just sexually attracted to children, are white.
That's type 2.
Okay.
We don't talk about that as a white problem, and we also don't say that the white community needs to work out what is going
Rachel,
wrong
talk to
here
Afra about
and why there is paedophilia in its ranks, which there clearly is.
No. I don't think we are talking about type 2 paedophilia, which is white men who are attracted to children.
No,
what we are
represented
talking
in
about is
society.
Asian grooming
I
gangs.
understand that,
and
but I
think
am
we
raising
need,
type 2.
We need very briefly to say this is a class problem, this is a cultural problem, and this is also a language problem.
Religion as well, by the way.
Also religion, because firstly on language, these are paedophiles who are raping children. Okay, let's just accept that. And these are not women, these are not girls in relationships with their abusers.
And
this
some
is
of
rape.
the language around child prostitution is very damaging, because there's no such thing as child prostitution.
They mustn't call the girl victims prostitutes. They are rape victims of rape. They are
and
children.
they were dismissed in this case.
Culturally, we have to understand why this goes on in this country. But finally, we haven't talked about class, and the reason why the authorities turned a blind eye and threw these girls under a bus or to the wolves was because they were, as it were, in an underclass. They thought these girls are out of education, they've been failed by social services. Honestly, if these were middle-class girls at boarding school, do you honestly think these children would not have been taken proper care of by the boarding school, by the authorities?
What I find astonishing is that even after all of Rotherham, Rochdale, Oxford, no prosecutions, no one
there have been prosecutions. There have been prosecutions.
How many?
There have been dozens of prosecutions, but not enough. Can we hear why this happens? Why
yes, let's go. And also, Majid, why, and if just come to the final point of my introduction, decent Muslims like yourself, you're being tarred by the brush, even worse than anyone else. What is to be done, Majid?
Oh, because it's men like me that get stereotyped as being rapists, and that's happening across Europe. But unfortunately, it's happening because across Europe, not just in Britain, there's a disproportionate rate of offending by either Muslim migrants or Muslims born and raised in Europe against white girls. And there are class reasons to it. There are patriarchal reasons to it. Why it happens in Muslim-majority nations is largely due to the social conservative attitudes in society and their patriarchal and misogynist attitudes towards women, and also cultural elements kick in. Now, for example, fundamentalist interpretations of Islam believe that as long as you have consent of the father, there's no underage, there's no pre-puberty, there's no limit on marrying a girl.
Pre-puberty?
They refer to the Prophet having married a 9 or 11-year-old, depending on the age of reference.
Right.
These attitudes must be challenged, and they must be addressed. Finally, to Afra's point, yes, either 87% or 100% of paedophiles in type 2, which is those who prey on young, vulnerable children, are white, either 87% or 100%. But that's reflective of society, so it's a problem.
100% of society isn't white, Majid.
Yeah, but that's why I'm saying it's between that number, because we have two conflicting figures. The problem needs to be addressed, but what it certainly isn't is 2% of the society committing 84% of the crime. That has to be addressed as a category on its own. Now, the police haven't been doing enough, nor have the politicians yet. This week alone, we find a journalist being stopped by counter-terrorism police at our borders under Section 7 of the Terrorism Act 2000, being deprived of the right of silence because she was distributing leaflets that were offensive to Muslims that said Allah is gay. That's not a racist leaflet. Yet we've got this going on in Telford, and I was ashamed at the lack of response and the drag, even in organisations such as the BBC, in reporting this.
Yes,
I was ashamed.
48 hours it took them.
We have to move on, but I'm sure this will come up again because it's such a terrible problem. There's light at the end of the tunnel for Britain's economy, according to the Chancellor, Philip Hammond. Unveiling his spring statement this week, he celebrated a reduction in the deficit and, albeit modest, an uptick in growth forecasts. That does not, however, mean the end to austerity. Far from it. Next month, we'll see the second largest annual cut to the benefits budget in a decade. And the Local Government Association says already stretched councils will have their budgets cut in half in the next couple of years. Public services will go on being catastrophically squeezed, and vulnerable people will continue to suffer. It's estimated that by 2022, 37% of children will live in relative poverty in the UK. Where is the light at the end of the tunnel for them? Austerity has created immeasurable pain, and it has deepened inequality. And this government doesn't even seem to care.
I don't want to get too crunchy, numbery with us, but I think that Philip Hammond decided there was going to be a narrative in the spring statements this week, and I'm not sure to what extent I believe he's more Tigger than Eeyore, as he put it in the Commons. The truth is that, yes, the deficit is, as a percentage of GDP, on the downward trend, good, but the national debt is still 1.7 trillion, and we still have to service that.
We are still in the tunnel at the moment. We have to get debt down. We've got all sorts of other things we want to do. We've taken a balanced approach over the last couple of fiscal events, using flexibility that we had to continue paying down debt, but also to provide additional support to our public services, to invest in Britain's future, and to reduce taxes.
He's also suggested that in the autumn statement that he will raise spending, but I'm just not confident, Afua, that your hopes of seeing benefits and money to the local authorities who are completely starved of cash going up. One, we look at what's going on in the world. We have to pump up the defence budget. That's going to be the priority of the government. Two, the reason why we haven't got more cash to splash is because actually tax receipts have been falling. Three, I think the corporation outlook is not looking good. I mean, Unilever's now relocating to Amsterdam. I don't want to bring Brexit into this conversation, but I think that...
It's related.
I just think that going forward, the fiscal outlook is getting worse, not better.
But just before I bring you in, that's also what's interesting about this, because the whole point of austerity was supposed to be to shore up confidence in Britain's economy, to attract investment, to show that we're good for business. And you see, there is this growing consensus that austerity in neoliberal countries doesn't work. It's counterproductive. The IMF has said that in countries like Britain with a strong reputation for fiscal good management, it does more harm than good. And that's what we're seeing. We're not seeing strong economic growth. The deficit is falling in relative terms, but it's rising in absolute terms because the economy is not growing.
Before we go to Nick, can we just look at some of these, what you're mentioning in terms of what's being cut? Can we, Nick, is that OK? We're going to see, this is what's actually happening. So if you look at, average real-term cuts, 26% cuts between 2010 and 2017. That's in local government. If you go to health, between 2010 and 2016, it's grown by 1.3% per year on average. It used to be 4%. So that's a cut there as well. Education between 2010 and 2016 has fallen by about 14%. And in policing, spending fell again by 14% between 2010 and 2015. I'm aware, Nick, that I kind of...
No problem, Sport. Yeah. Well, let's just put a couple of corrections there. Yes, you're right about Unilever, but it's an accounting exercise. No jobs are being lost in Britain, and at the same time, they pledged to play in some billions of pounds of investment in the UK as well. So let's go the true, and that must be true because your brother told me that on the radio this morning. So it has to be true. Right. Afua, you're right, but the reason that we have recovered the economy, and I'm sorry, there is growth. Growth is likely to be
1.1%.
No, 1.4%. Yes, so it's just to nail this, it's 1.4%, which is 0.1% higher than forecast, but better than we thought. At the same time, there is record employment and there are other economic indicators that we're doing well. That has been achieved, like it or not, by austerity measures. That is... Now, hold on one second. Does that mean now that, having got to where we are, we consider just loosening the purse strings towards medical staff, towards other... Yes, I think it probably does. But your rather all-encompassing, gloomy portrayal, we've blown everything up, all children are going... I know you didn't say all, but I'm a tabloid journalist. All children are living in poverty, we're all going to die, and there's a plague of locusts, is not true. It's financial stewardship that's got us sort of back on track.
But at what cost, Nick? That's the question, you know... I can see on you, and there are lots of contesting and contradictory statistics on this, and I'm not going to go into a kind of Brexit economic growth stat off
this week.
This week. Look forward to that on future episodes of The Pledge. But there are these really disturbing indicators about how the most vulnerable people in society are suffering disproportionately. I'm just going to show you, since we've heard from Philip Hammond, what John McDonnell has to say.
In every public service, a crisis on a scale we've never seen before. Hasn't he listened to the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, the police officers, the carers, and even his own councillors? They're telling him they can't wait for the next budget. They're telling him to act now.
And it's not just the absolute effects of austerity, it's the relative effects. Look at how the poorest tenth of the population have fared. Their income has dropped by 10%. The richest tenth have only seen a 0.4% reduction. This is deepening inequality. Black people have had an average drop in income by over 5%, twice the size of the drop in income.
I want to respond,
but
there's steam like a kettle coming out of
No,
the ears of
no,
someone
no,
opposite,
no,
so I
no.
must yield the floor.
No, but I mean, I'm just listening to him, you know, the man who every fiscal policy, every socialist policy Labour ever produces and puts forward is ripped apart within hours of it coming out because it doesn't make sense. Look at all the other, you know, Labour keep on saying we have to spend, we have to spend. And for who's going to pay for it all? You know, are we going to print money like Europe does every week? Are we going to keep on doing that? Of course,
To be fair, don't forget, my brother actually called for billions more into the NHS the other day.
Yeah,
didn't
but,
he?
and groups like the
Every-
IMF say that this actually increases growth so that there is more money
That's
to
where the
spend.
money comes from.
We've got two
That's where the money
neoliberals
comes from.
here, Carol. Come on, take them on.
No, I just think the public opinion's turning, and I think I'm a bit of a... I've been sort of a weather gauge on this, or like a weather vane, and in that, during the coalition government, I was a bit hesitant to criticise the cuts because we'd come out of this huge crash, and everybody was generally around the table agreeing that we need to cut back on some stuff, right? But actually now, public opinions change, and I've changed along with it, and that is that people are less and less sympathetic to the notion
But
that
not, it
austerity
hasn't
needs to
changed
continue.
hugely, Imagine.
Even Nick
No,
has
but it
just
hasn't
agreed
changed
Tiny
that we need
touch
to
on the
listen.
It hasn't changed. Support for cuts to public spending fell to 29% compared to 5% when the question was first asked in 2006. So this is, but that's it's taken 8 years to get that few percent. People, because most people understand you have to pay your debt off, because if we don't, we're leaving trillions for our children.
The poorest
Who's
are
going to pay
paying
for your
more.
socialist
The
policies?
poorest are paying more, Carol.
Who's going to pay? You know, we tried to save money with, you know, with benefits and stuff. You know, IDS is
In the red corner. Come on up.
It's the loony lefty over here. Why does everything have to be so polarised? We all want the same things. We want economic growth. I assume we all do not want to see inequality
I think that's the
deepen.
point. It's the growth, the economic growth that comes from the stimulation to the economy that will pay for it.
okay. After the break, it's my turn, and I think there's no excuse for not speaking English. So, I want to talk about the English language and why so many people in Britain can't speak it. This week, the former integration czar, Dame Louise Casey, said Britain should set a date for everyone living here to be able to speak English to help heal the growing problem of segregation. Already I can hear the liberal lefties screaming that this is racist and disrespects particular religions. Looking at you, Afua, governments and public institutions cannot fear being demonised for trying to stamp out segregation, misogyny and patriarchy. People who want to live here and share in Britain's fantastic spoils must be prepared to integrate. They can't shut themselves away in closed communities, taking what this country has to offer, but giving nothing back. And if they can't speak English, they can't give anything back. Segregation leads to alienation, and that's dangerous. But this isn't just about migration and immigration. It's about equality for women, particularly Muslim women, according to Dame Louise, many of whom speak no English at all. So it's simple. If you come here and you refuse to learn our language, you don't get to stay.
It's actually lovely to have you rejoin the side of feminism, Carol.
Oh, it's lovely to have you
were
patronising
such
me
an
again. It's
active
so nice.
campaigner against misogyny. I'm enjoying that. You said so many people can't speak English. So I have a couple of stats for you. So the number of people who say they can't speak English well, it's 1.3% of society. The number of the people you're talking about who can't speak English at all, 0.3%.
136,000 now. It's a lot of people.
0.3%
A lot of people.
society. So the idea that we're kind of in this society stuffed full of people who can't speak English, which is what I kind of
Do you
get
not
from
care
you.
about the ones who can't?
No, I do. And on that, I agree with you. I think you will not have equality of opportunity if you can't speak English. And that's why I have been so critical of government spending cuts to ESOL, which is English for speakers of other languages, which has been cut by more than £100 million in recent years. So my critique of you is not what you're saying per se, because I agree. I think people need to be able to speak English if they are to thrive in this country. My critique is that instead of seeing this for what it is, which is a failure of leadership, a failure of government policy. You're putting the emphasis on individual people as if it's sometimes their negligence.
You have
not
a
learning
responsibility to learn to speak the language. It's arrogant and disrespectful not to speak the language.
It's our responsibility to have services that allow people
and we have them.
And
we have them. We gave
as I said,
20 million
we
quid.
have
David
cut them
Cameron, 2
by,
years ago, 20 million quid. I think the others might want to pop
20 million, Carol. They've been cut by 100 million.
Yes, and they're getting 50 million this year.
So why is it that you're so passionate about people speaking English,
it's a
but not willing
responsibility
to see that you don't think it's something that
I think it's a personal responsibility.
So therefore, it's their
Carol, I was with you until you said...
You have to go.
I was with you, you had me at hello, but you lost me at they can't give something back. Just because you can't speak English, you could be working
What can
in a
you give
job...
back?
Well, you could be contributing to society. Where I am totally with you, and I find the numbers that AFWA's gone through is quite interesting, is if you're living in this country, which hopefully we all agree is a great country, if you are going to benefit from what this country offers, it would seem to me to make sense that you speak the language. I worry about, and I don't pretend to know, but I hear about there are areas in cities such as Blackburn and Bradford and other areas, where I am told that, I've not been there personally, you just don't hear English spoken. I don't know that's particularly healthy. I also question the amount of money that has to be spent by the NHS, by local courts and other services, local councils, on interpretations and interpreters for council leaflets. If you happen to be in Spain, or you live in France, or you live in wherever it might be, Portugal, everything comes through the door and it's your responsibility. So I think there's a cost there. All that being said, I don't quite... And I think it's very interesting what Dame Louise said, but what are you ultimately going to do if you have, for the purpose of debate, a little old lady living in Bolton who just cannot, and she's come from India, and she cannot get the level? Are you honestly going to say we're going to kick her out?
I'm not talking about... a personal example here, please? Yeah. I mean, this is clearly something that affects my communities directly, and it affects me directly. And I was with you until you said a different line, and that was when you said if you don't learn English, you should leave.
Go home.
Now, the reason that affects me personally is that
Would you like me to go home?
So
What, South West London?
Your home's Wimbledon.
All the way to Wimbledon.
So, my mother speaks English as well as all of us, but my stepmom, my parents are divorced, my stepmom, who my father remarried, recently wanted to, with my father, adopt a Syrian refugee child because she can't have children for herself. And she was refused because they told her that the foster... it was fostering, not adopting, and the foster caring services told her that her English wasn't good enough, and so they refused a child at home.
There's a point there, isn't there?
Yeah. So back 8 years ago, we at Quilliam issued a report called Triple Paralysis. And the paralysis we looked at that was discriminating against Pakistani and Bangladeshi, South Asian, Muslim, British women was threefold. One, they were Muslim. Second, they were immigrants. And third, they were women.
Yes.
And so we found that they were the most deprived economically, challenged economically in the country. They had the least social mobility. They were the least employed. And they were the group that spoke the least
And they will
English.
always have low-status employment if they don't
speak English.
But there's
Now, what I'm worried about...
They are the highest
exactly.
Definitely something needs to be done. But on the cuts point that Afua mentioned, I agree, because actually, if we have a look at this, there has been a 60% funding cut in real terms when it comes to teaching English language. And again, 8 years ago, we recommended the government continue to spend on teaching English language because it's the only way people like my stepmom can actually learn. What I wouldn't want to do, and I'm sure you'd agree with me, Carol, is if her English isn't good enough to adopt a Syrian refugee child, I'm sure you wouldn't say that she should be expelled from this country.
No, but the point of it,
I want you to address that, because your last line was quite offensive.
Well, I'm just not going to address you in the order you said. I want to say, if she's going to adopt a Syrian child, she has to engage with schools, with local authorities, with local services. So it makes absolute sense for her to
she shouldn't be expelled for not being able to speak English, should she?
Majid, why should the taxpayer pay for your stepmom to learn English?
Yeah, well, actually, the real question there is actually a deeper question as to whether, when it comes to these sorts of market failures, the taxpayer should step in or not. Because actually, if she could get work, she'd be paying taxes and would then pay the taxpayer back.
I mean, some would
say, there is an economic argument.
Some would say, get your stepmom, go out and learn English yourself. Some might say.
She's tried. She has tried.
Rachel, I think that we've identified two problems. One, there isn't the availability of English language lessons because of the cuts. But two, there isn't really the will on the part of those who who are in this country living in segregated areas where they speak their own language to go and learn English and then therefore integrate better.
So
we've got two problems which are actually contributing towards, for example, I would argue the Asian grooming gang situation.
Yes,
if you had women, if you had the women in these families who are part of society and not sitting at home amongst their own kind, who actually were involved, who could go to the authorities, speak to the authorities about this, you wouldn't have these problems.
Let's look at what Dame Louise Katie has to say about this.
English language is absolutely vital. It's our common denominator. It's what brings us all together as a nation. So I want more done on English language skills. I want more opportunities for people in these areas around employment. We need people out of low status employment like taxis and chicken shops, though they're all useful, but they need to have a trajectory that goes further into life. I want more mixing opportunities for all young people, whether that's black, white, rich, poor, Muslim, non-Muslim. We all need to mix with each other as we're growing up. That would make us a stronger and healthier nation.
What Dame Louise also says is that too many public institutions in this country have spent too much money making life too easy for people who can't speak English. Now, let's just give you some of the costs here for translations. Edinburgh City Council's translations included Kurdish, Badani, Sorani, dialects, all sorts of dialects. Crawley County Council paid £600 to have 12 lifestyle magazines translated into English because one woman who spoke only Urdu complained about it. You have, I think it was Warwickshire County Council paid hundreds of pounds to have a weight-busting leaflet transferred into Punjabi. Now, and it's costing, wait a minute, it's costing public services councils who are on the verge of going bankrupt companies, it's costing them £150 million a year for translation services. People have a responsibility to
stop that. What we said 8 years ago is take the money you save from stopping those translation exercises and put them towards teaching English language courses. That's what we said 8 years ago.
Carol, what you're talking about, you're conflating so many things, and now you seem to be on the side of not pushing councils to breaking point financially, which you weren't necessarily when I raised austerity. The point is there's bad public decision making in councils. That's ridiculous. If a council's squeezed, it can't provide basic services. It shouldn't be translating 12 lifestyle magazines into a number of languages. At the same time, I don't think you can blame minority communities for bad decisions made by local councils. And I see this whole question of English as people who can you let me finish my point, Carol? Let me finish my point.
You said it 10 minutes ago.
This whole debate about people not being able to speak English, I see this as a symptom and not a cause. We're talking about it as if it's a cause. The reason that they're not integrated, the reason they're not employed is because they don't speak English. The reason they don't speak English is because they're living in segregated areas, over-characterised by poverty, lacking in opportunity, and not properly serviced by public services.
Guys, we've got
responsibility. And they're structured the language of the country they live in.
Talking of the consequences of poisonous language in this case, we've got to move on because this is the pledge on Sky News. Up next, I'm taking on, I should say, the abhorrent Punish a Muslim leaflets. Now, in a sickening letter sent out across the country, April 3rd has been dubbed Punish a Muslim Day. The letter rates various stages of attack on Muslims, including 25 points for pulling off a woman's headscarf, 500 points for murdering a Muslim, and 1,000 points for bombing a mosque. Suspect packages with unidentified liquids have also been sent to 4 Muslim MPs at Westminster. For over 10 years, I've argued that legal but inflammatory language by Muslim extremists creates an atmosphere in which jihadist terrorists can recruit. So similarly, language that stokes up anti-Muslim sentiment will create an atmosphere that breeds anti-Muslim violence. Assuming this letter turns out genuine, and I say that with a big caveat, I urge sections of the media and anti-Islam campaigners to pause and deeply ponder their use of language. I'm making no suggestion they had any involvement in the letter directly, but all of us have a responsibility to challenge extremist rhetoric. You can advocate against religion without inciting against its believers, just as you can say smoking is bad without saying you hate all smokers. People should be free to scrutinise Islam, but they must not aid the hatred of Muslims.
Majid, there's no argument around this table that those leaflets are vile and disgusting and should not be should not be allowed to circulate in this country. But what I hear at the back of what you're saying there, this is about free speech. It's about what people say and how they say it. And I guess you could say that free speech depends upon the ability to criticise, to ridicule, to just dispute with, and we have to be able to do that, even if it's in a way that you don't necessarily agree with. I mean, I think we've talked before, and you talk to me about newspapers and the language they use when they're covering stories that involve Muslims. But I wanted to read you something that the despicable Anjem Chowdhury said after the Charlie Hebdo massacres, and he was saying that Muslims may not agree with he said they don't agree with the idea of freedom of expression. Even non-Muslims who espouse it say it comes with responsibilities. He said, in an increasingly unstable and insecure world, the potential consequences of insulting the messenger Muhammad are known to Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Now, that last sentence seems to say to me that they were warned, they had it coming. And so every time we tell people not to say things in a certain way, not to say things that we disagree with, we're giving credence to Chowdhury and his belief that, don't say things that I don't like because there will be consequences. And I think in this nation we live in, I mean, you're talking presumably about the free speech in newspapers, and I'm sure there are probably one or two particular newspapers you don't like the way they would cover a story that involved a Muslim. But I still think we can't, in the same free speech, it's nasty.
Not allow hate speech, Carol.
Sorry?
This isn't free speech.
This isn't free speech. It's not. We're not talking about hate. We're not
This
talking
is hate speech.
The whole reason that Anjem Chowdhury is prosecuted is because there are limits on what you can say in a democracy where there is free speech and there's also protection against hate speech. So I think my interpretation of what Majid is saying is that some of the rhetoric in the press has transgressed from valid debate into inciting hate against Muslim groups.
And give me some examples.
I'll give you examples.
Yeah,
right? So I don't want to name names for obvious reasons, but we know that of late there have been some very prominent campaigners, some of whom have been accused by their own political party that if they were to come to prominence, it would be like Nazis taking over their own political party because of their views on Muslims. Likewise, other prominent campaigners, some of them have been my colleagues, have said things like, use words like the final solution when referring to Muslims. What I'm urging everybody to do...
And not just Muslims. Jews.
I'm not saying we ban speech that we don't like. What I'm saying is there is an area between illegal speech, which is directly inciting violence, and what we find acceptable within civil society. That grey area is usually when we challenge bigoted speech, even if it's legal. So, if a Muslim extremist came on this show and said, I want to kill gays in the future caliphate, we would all challenge them, even though they are perfectly
But you would accept it's been said in the public arena. That very thing has been said in the public arena.
They're perfectly within their legal rights to say that, because they're talking about a future law they want in a state. But we'd still nevertheless challenge them. We wouldn't tolerate that speech. And I'm arguing, likewise, if somebody's an anti-Islam campaigner, uses words such as final solution to deal with Muslims after a terror attack, that speech needs to be challenged, and it has no place in civilized society.
You're right. You're absolutely right. But what I find astonishing you're talking about right wing here. If you look at the left wing arena, in our very own Labour Party, we have people in that party saying the most hideous things about Jews, and yet it doesn't go unchallenged, but it actually largely goes unpunished.
But you're preaching to the choir, Karen. This is what's aboutery here. I'm not sure why you're sidestepping.
Majid, you said something interesting. You said you called on all media organisations, I'm going to quote the words, to pause. Are you saying, is there a danger in some instances that by reporting these stories, actually you are bringing them to a wider audience who aren't aware of it, and these vile specimens think, wow, how do I sign up? Is that something media... Is that what you would drive?
But there is that danger, but that shouldn't stop us reporting on it, not at all. And that's why I use the example that smoking is bad, not all smokers are bad people.
Okay.
We've got to be able to report about it in a responsible way.
And you sense that's not happening?
Well, with the examples I gave, it's certainly not. There are certain prominent campaigners who speak in inflammatory ways, and also, of course, certain tabloid newspapers have inflammatory ways of dealing with.
Still?
Words like cockroaches referring to...
Well, that's one extreme example. That was a disgusting example.
I'm not saying ban speech. I'm saying just as we wouldn't want Islamists running around saying extremist things without being challenged, I'm saying we should also challenge some rhetoric that's coming from anti-Muslim quarters.
I think you're you know, we've got to look at, you know, Carol's point is, you know, free speech, but we have to see the consequences of not checking, if not having a pause, because the rise in hate crime, religious and race crime has gone up by something like 30% since last year or 2 years.
29%.
29%.
Just over 80,000.
You know, that is a real indictment of the tone of society at the moment, the tone of discourse, and the fact that, you know, we are seeing such polarisation, but also a sense of a licensing of some of the xenophobia that there's been an outbreak of.
OK, but there was a report...
what is behind the licensing of xenophobia?
I would like to say something. I think it's ironic that we're having this debate at the end of this show, because today we've talked about Muslim grooming gangs, and we've also talked about people mainly from Muslim communities, because it's Pakistani and Bangladeshi women who are particularly identified by Louise Casey as not speaking English. Now, all of those stories are completely valid and areas that I think we've all agreed deserve attention. But they feed into, because of the underlying prejudice in the society, a sense of Islamophobia. And if you go to an EDL rally, as I have, you don't hear there is a minority of people in the Muslim community that's abusing girls. You hear Muslim pedos off our streets.
That's the language I'm talking about.
And we have, and it's not a level playing field. I am committed to free speech, but I also acknowledge that free speech is not equally free, because there are some groups who have disproportionate platform and others who don't have a platform at all. And that is my worry, and that's why I can see how this...
Why isn't the Muslim community coming out and challenging the stereotypes more?
How many Muslim editors are there of newspapers, columnists and newspapers, TV anchors, people on chat shows? The reality is they are underrepresented.
How many Chinese editors are there? We don't know.
Is racism against Chinese people a huge issue in society? No.
We have a double problem. There aren't enough Muslims challenging things like the grooming gangs. At the same time, we've got this problem, which is why it's actually a good thing we're debating it on the same show, because it shows there's a triple threat we're facing, whether it's the far left extremists, the far right extremists, or the theocrats. And we shouldn't... Look, if we were going to worry about the consequences of topics we pick, then we may as well say nothing at all, ever. You know? We've got to be able to discuss things like Russia. We discuss Russia, it may well incite World War III. We have to talk about it, right?
I love the idea of the pledge of case on the triggering
Cite an example.
We've got to, Carol, we've got to move on. Sorry, our time is up, and we won't stop talking.
Well, I hope that time's not up.
Don't worry about that. Right, it's time now for our Straight Talker of the Week. He was one of the brightest brains Britain has ever produced and achieved what many would have thought impossible, getting people genuinely interested in theoretical physics. But Professor Stephen Hawking wasn't just a straight-laced scientist, oh no. He'll also be remembered for his rather biting sense of humour. This is him receiving the Royal Society for the Arts Premier Award, the Albert Medal, from the Duke of Edinburgh in 1999.
Thank you for awarding it to someone with an American accent.
For gems like that, Professor Hawking gets our posthumous Straight Talker of the Week. So thank you, all of you. That's all we've got time for this week. But you can join in the debate by searching for The Pledge on Facebook and on Twitter. Thank you for watching.